Come on now.
Thanks everyone, thanks Tabitha, thanks NeueHouse, thanks PBS, thanks BBC One. Woo!
Hi. So, Ridley Road. Ridley Road was originally a novel
Yes.
by Joe Bloom. When did you come across this story, Sarah? And what was it that grabbed you and made you think, I'm going to spend years making this into a series?
I knew that there was a far-right presence in the East End of London. My family lived near Ridley Road, but I didn't know the extent of it. I didn't know how organised it was. I didn't know that they marched through Ridley Road with swastikas. They had a rally in Trafalgar Square. A lot of the footage you see that we got from Pathy was real footage of the rally. And it was perfectly legal in 1962 to have a swastika in Trafalgar Square, and you got a permit from the council and you got police protection. So the 62 group was formed to fight the fascists off the streets of London and throughout the country, and often they were arrested. So I didn't realise how organised it was, and then I was just kind of drawn to it and committed to it, and just spent like the next 8 years trying to persuade someone to make it. And no one would, but eventually BBC said yes.
I mean, one of the things that really was tough for me to get my head around is that it's set in 1962, which is only 20 years after World War II. You would think everyone in Britain would be terrified of fascism.
Right.
I mean, do you think there was some sort of effort to kind of wipe what had happened under the carpet in Britain after the war, because it was just such a sort of horrific memory?
Well, what was interesting about researching it was that it was called the Jewish War still into the 60s. It was a war that we shouldn't have got involved with. And we now, with the hindsight of history, like to think that we were on the right side of it, and that Hitler, Nazism died in the bunker. But actually there was a fascist legacy in England that carried on into the 60s. We like to think of it was swinging 60s, it was free love and everything was hopeful, but people were still fighting them off outside their houses and outside their businesses. And when this show came out, I think people were really uncomfortable with what it brought up about our history and our legacy. But actually we have a very rich heritage of fighting fascism, and the 62 group, along with other minority organisations and anti-fascist organisations, successfully pushed them to the fringes of British politics.
I mean, do you have any ideas why do you think it was so hard to get made, or is that just shows are hard to get made?
Well, 8-10 years ago, people weren't talking about fascism. People thought it was something from history. Hello.
It's the past.
And then with everything that happened and Brexit and Trump, and people started asking questions about why we were coming, people were being seduced into these far-right views. And when they started asking those questions, things like this, which were really just considered very niche and wouldn't get much of an audience, people started thinking, okay, maybe that's something to unpack where we are, and why people are kind of good people are can become convinced of bad ideas.
So many of the characters in the show are actually based on real characters, but Vivian is an invention. How is it useful having Vivian as a way to sort of draw people into the story?
Well, I wanted to take a young, innocent girl, played by the brilliant Agnes O'Casey, who's here. Can we just give her a round of applause? Get up, Agnes. This is her first time in America, ladies and gentlemen. They let her in. Thank you, Eddie.
And Agnes's first screen
debut.
Yeah.
First gig. First of many. I wanted to take a young girl from Manchester who had no experience of espionage or spycraft, and just tell the truth of what that would be like. And often in spy genre things, you see someone and suddenly they like have high kicks and they know what to do and they really, they figure everything out. And I wanted to use all the skills actually which are in Jo Bloom's book, all the feminine skills, like her being a hairdresser and learning how to dye her hair and being good with people and reading the room and being undermined because she's a young girl, and all of those skills are her weapons. And as the season progresses, you'll realise actually the things that people undermine her for and don't take her seriously for are the things that she becomes so successful in espionage. And
being underestimated is her secret weapon.
Yes.
So was it dicey or strange? Were you kind of nervous about humanising the Nazi characters, and in the writing process did you have to kind of rationalise what the thought process of a character like a Colin Jordan would have gone through to get to the place he was at?
I don't think anyone ever sets out to be a villain of history. No one is like, I'm going to go down in the books as being the biggest arsehole that was ever. Everyone thinks they're doing the best thing, the necessary thing in that moment. And we often see, when we're doing Jewish stories or stories of Nazis, we see characters that are these sort of zombies that are monstrous and robotic and automatons and cause pain. But the truth is, they're people like you and me in circumstances when they're presented with a reductive ideology that blames someone else for often their economic situation, that goes, that sounds like common sense, that sounds logical. So as you see as the season progresses, you see like Nettie, the landlady, who has to leave her house. We'll talk about housing in a minute.
I can't wait.
Has to leave her house. She's lost 3 sons in the war. There's a wave of immigration coming from the Commonwealth. We ship lots of people in to do low income jobs, like in healthcare and in transport. And she's frightened of the new climate that she sees herself in. She's vulnerable to far-right ideology. So in this show, as you watch it, you'll realise each of the far-right characters do have a backstory that is relevant to why they make those decisions. And you have to humanise it if you understand where it comes from.
I mean, when you were researching, were you recognising kind of present-day rhetoric in the speeches and things that people were saying in that era?
Yeah, I mean, they would say, we have to take our country back. I mean, that's a quite popular slogan that's been used. It's not that original. And the truth is, you can't ever take a country back. Even if you sling off some imperialist rule, you'll never be able to take it back. You can take it forward, you can't take it back. So people would accuse me of being like an anti-Brexiteer and say I'm using it. That language was used by the Nazis in 1962. But also on the left, in England, Zionism is often used as a dirty word, as a slur. And the far right used Zionist control, Zionist conspiracy, elite Zionists controlling everything. That was used. So I sort of borrowed from left and right. And actually I have to say, in England when this came out, it managed to antagonise absolutely everyone. The far right stormed the synagogue. We shoot scenes later in the season. The far right stormed the synagogue we shot in, Manchester Reform Synagogue. They stormed an online service. Suddenly they were flooded with people. They all changed their avatars to swastikas and started hurling abuse. They had to shut down the service. We annoyed the left, who said it was a misinterpretation of what actually happened, and we ignored we agitated the right, who said it was we weren't fascist at all, and there was no fascist history, which was quite impressive to manage to agitate everyone.
Muzzle. Often it is a localised experience as well as a kind of universal one. Would you say that the kind of British Jewish experience, or how is the British Jewish experience in comparison to, say, an American or Israeli? Is there something specific about that history, do you think?
That's a big one. When I was promoting this show, I realised even with educated, left-leaning journalists, there were a few misconceptions. For example, they didn't realise how few Jews there were in Britain. There's only 260,000. It's a tiny minority, but often is in the headlines because we had a terrible problem with anti-Semitism in our opposition party and the Labour Party. And other things like people assume that Haredi or Lubavitch communities who are smartly dressed are rich. That was a big shock. They're often not rich at all, living under the poverty line materially. And Zionism again is not quite understood in the context of the Jewish experience, and is used as a slogan left wing. So it's just a thorny one. We've always had this kind of issue with anti-Semitism in England, and
because you kind of you sort of expect that from the right wing. They have a problem with everyone, but the anti-Semitism that seems to kind of crop up in the left in Britain seems quite a specific.
Yeah, it's a big one, and it's to do with the Middle East and to do with the solidarity with the Palestinian struggle, but often it very complex issues with the Middle East get reduced to really the anti-Semitic tropes of Zionist control of banks, of media, of things, which just isn't truthful.
Was it important to you to try and kind of reframe the word anti-fascist? Because you would never really think the word anti-fascist could become a slur, but that did seem to happen.
Right. I wrote this like 8 years ago, and I just didn't think that it would still be making everyone so upset. But it's interesting that we are still faced with this kind of confrontation, and this is what we're dealing with. When we think about never again, we never want fascism again, we never want Nazis again. For me, I think it's a bit misleading, because whenever there's a complicated world order, there will always be someone who's offering a reductive ideology. So it's always going to be around, and you have to keep the body politic healthy.
I mean, do you think that recently it does seem to be kind of more in the public consciousness? I don't know if it's because anti-Semitism is on the rise or whether people are paying attention to it, but do you have any thoughts on that, or why do you think it is raising its ugly head again?
I think why anti-Semitism is raising its head.
Yeah.
I think whenever people feel overwhelmed and confused, and we live in quite an accelerated time in our culture, everything's being questioned and everything's being looked at under the microscope, and identity and race and gender and class and everything. It's too much for people to cope with. So if you can give them something that is reductive, that makes them emotionally connect and make sense, then it's going to take sway. And it's not just anti-Semitism. You see it in Islamophobia. You see it in I'm working with Fawzia Kufi from Afghanistan, who's like the Hillary Clinton of Afghanistan. And if you look at the rise of the Taliban and the popularity that they receive, it's the same. It's the same kind of fears, and it's the same kind of solutions, whether it's Afghanistan, India, Eastern Europe, America, or England in 1962. It's the same context.
Yeah, because it, I guess the old sort of divide and conquer is a big one, but it is effective. And I mean, do you see this as a kind of a bigger argument than one group? I mean, we were talking earlier about how Oswald Mosley, famous British fascist, his kind of strategy was more of an attack on democracy itself.
Yeah, so the fascists' aim is to completely dismantle the party system. So Oswald Mosley was a senior politician. He ended up representing both Labour and Conservative in England, and he had a 5-point plan, and he said that Westminster doesn't work, that democracy is a sham, and that the only solution was really to sort of trust him. I alone can fix it. It's that same kind of rhetoric,
which is rings familiarly. It has a familiar ring, is what I'm trying to say.
Yes, exactly.
So it is hard sometimes to not feel totally powerless and overwhelmed, like you say, but do you see this show in some regards as a hopeful show, even though it's uncovering an ugly history?
I do. I mean, the 62 group, they succeeded ultimately. They pushed this party to the fringes of British politics, and where there is life, there is hope. And I feel very invigorated by researching these activists, bringing them to the screen, and I feel very hopeful about things. It's a good time to be engaged. It's a good time to understand what's happening. It's a good time to feel connected with other people, and when you are an activist or you contribute to democracy, you have an antidote to overwhelm. You have an antidote to feeling confused and conflicted.
Do you think that's kind of the best start for people who want to engage with this movement to push back against this kind of uprising of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, education, to become more informed?
Yeah, I think being involved is invigorating. It certainly, with these characters that I researched, there was a lot of humour, there was a lot of camaraderie. It was us against them and we're going to defeat them. And I think when you have that kind of connection and you connect to your life force.
I'm sure everyone's excited to see the subsequent episodes. When and where can we see them?
It'll be on PBS May 1st, 6 p.m. EST, which is what LA time? 3 p.m.
That felt like a proper talk show. You do have, I was going to say fingers in other pies, but it seemed like it was the wrong metaphor for what we're about to say. You are interested in some other hot topics. For example, your new Me Too drama that is coming out very shortly.
Yes, it's a show called Chivalry. It's a Me Too satire with Steve Coogan that's out now on Channel 4 in the UK, and it'll be coming to a streaming service soon in the US.
I can't bloody wait to see it.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you.